Please welcome Dave and Dale to the S4 Main Stage.
We had originally scheduled to have Phil Venables up here at this time, but as some of you who actually read the emails probably learned, he wrote me back. He wanted me to say an emergency family situation, and everything is fine now, but it kind of cropped up yesterday, so he couldn't make it. So we'll get him down here some other year, get him on the unsolicited response show. So what we're doing is we're moving Dave up to this spot. He was going to be in the afternoon, and then at 3:30, Keith London and Nathan Brubaker are going to talk about In Controller here in the main stage. So it's all in the agenda. But Dave, welcome to S4.
Thank you very much for having me here.
You have kind of a unique background. I thought it would be great to be able to talk to you in front of the S4 audience here. You now, as part of Cisco, you're on the Cisco Advisory.
Yeah, we're called the Advisory CISOs, which is part of the strategy team for Cisco.
So every week you're talking to CISOs?
Yeah, actually for the last 2 years specifically, we've been having, myself been doing security roundtables with CISOs, and it's been really enlightening to see all the different CISOs from the different industry verticals sharing what they're up against.
And so there's a few of those, but what makes you a little unique is that 10, 12 years ago you worked with, do they pronounce it IESO, or how do they pronounce that?
IESO.
IESO, so Ontario's power system, and you worked for Hydro One,
Yep.
which was Toronto's, and AMD, which manufactures chips. So you have some experience in ICS.
Yes, I still wake up screaming.
So I guess maybe to start, you were there 10, 12 years ago.
Yes.
And now you're talking to CISOs, probably some of them have ICSs now that are very important to them. How are CISOs different now with regard to how they think about and deal with ICS than they were 10, 12 years ago?
So 10, 12 years ago, a lot of the times what it was the CISO was seen as, something off to the side that was there because it needed to check a box. And a lot of times, especially in environments that I worked in, it was OT versus IT, the never-ending battle, when it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me because a lot of the same shared resources. So the CISOs didn't really get a seat at the table in a lot of ways. And nowadays we're finding that has fundamentally shifted, where the board has realized that security is an absolute essential issue that has to be discussed. And now they've essentially become the dog that caught the bumper. And now we just got to figure out what to do with that car.
That sounds more like kind of a generic difference in CISOs,
yes.
10 to 12 years ago from now. Is there anything specific in ICS? Like I'm thinking 10, 12 years ago, a lot of times if there was a CISO, they just didn't even have their hands on the ICS. But are you seeing that now?
That is completely true. Yes, there was an absolute separation between the two, and now I'm seeing, I'm going to say the horrible word, convergence, because I know there's the two camps that ne'er the twain shall meet. But the practical reality is, it's not something that should be seen as a detractor. It is definitely something that is going to get to a better place of harmonizing the environments and making sure that you're reducing the risk overall. It's not a case of just slap in a box with blinky lights and hope for the best. There has to be a real concerted effort to look at the risks that are involved and how that will impact. So, for example, if your systems go down and you can't make teddy bears anymore, that's one thing. If your system go down and it's a blackout in the middle of February, that's an entirely different kettle of fish.
You mentioned this convergence. Yes, bless you. You mentioned this convergence issue, and I think that one of the questions I get asked a lot is, what should be the structure of our organization to deal with ICS security? Should we have, an IT division or an OT division in ICS? Should operations handle it? Should we, there's all these different structural sorts of things. I guess as a two-part question, what do you see CISOs liking the most, and what do you think would be the most effective if it's different than what CISOs like the most?
Well, CISOs are about reducing risk and protecting the environment, and the OT environment, the OT folks are about protecting the environment as well. So I see a logical progression where the two will converge in some manner, and it's going to take quite a long time before it gets to the point where security is no longer part of the equation. And what I mean by that is, fundamentally, security, in my way of thinking, should be woven into every aspect of the business. And I believe wholeheartedly that at some point in the future, I shouldn't exist. At one point in the history, there was a thing called a chief electricity officer that was in charge of when light bulbs were a brand new thing. That role doesn't exist anymore. And I think that security fundamentally at some point down the line should be part of everything. I don't think that we're going to hit that level of maturity for quite a few years, but I think that is achievable. And my apologies, the second part of the question?
Well, no, let's stay there. That's really interesting. So you would think that, 5, 10, 20 years down the road, the CIO would include part of the CISO job?
I think it's fundamentally possible that we can get to that point, but there is a great deal of heavy lifting that has to happen. It has to be a firm understanding about what risk is in an environment, not just financial, but IT related as well, because all of this is about making sure that we're protecting the workplace, the workload, and the workforce. And we want to make sure that when we're doing that, we're doing it in a way that makes sense. We're trying to democratize security for the end users. And when you're in an OT environment, IT environment, whatever it happens to be, if you're giving folks that are tools written by engineers for engineers, you're going to have a very limited subset of people that are able to actually make use of them. So you want to make sure that we're doing things in a way that is going to be easier to use, and ultimately you're then going to be able to converge all these systems together in a way that makes sense. You don't want to rush into it by any stretch of the imagination, because there is a culture shift that has to happen, right? There are the two camps, we all know it, and we have to figure out some way to get together. I mean, we are able to teach a rock to think. And think about that for a second. If we can figure out that, I'm sure we can figure out how to get along.
A rock to think?
Computers.
Oh, sorry, I missed that one. It's funny because that sort of flies in the face. There's a lot of people really pushing that they be separate and they have their separate line of reporting. But I guess I think back to, we had some people on stage a couple of years ago talking about DevOps, and I remember up in the green room, she said, I really hate DevOps Sec, because she said security is part of DevOps. It's not some extra buzzword. So it's almost that same kind of thinking, that it's just this should be part of every other thing you do for information systems.
I agree with that completely. I honestly think it should all be part and parcel of the same thing. And because security aspect of things has only been around for a couple of decades, this is a relatively immature market segment, as opposed to medical profession or jurisprudence and things like that. So I think that it will be quite a while before we get there, but I believe fully that we can get to that point, because I would much rather own a bookstore or a coffee shop.
That is really interesting. And then I think you could have your chief risk officer handle that part that wouldn't fall under the CIO.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a few people that want to keep IT completely out of operations, completely out of OT. If you were talking to one of these people, what would be the most compelling way for them to talk to their CISO to make the case that operations should handle all of this and IT should stay out?
Well, if they can make the business case that they are able to reduce risk and fundamentally improve the security of their organization, and their customer base, whoever it happens to be, if it's electricity, water, whatever it happens to be, you want to be able to make a coherent business case that is going to resonate with the board, because they're all about how much is this going to cost, what is the risk involved to the organization. That is fundamentally what it boils down to for them. So if you're able to speak their lingua franca, that's a really huge piece of the puzzle. If you're able to provide them with the visibility for them to understand what's happening on their network, that would be absolutely key. I had a couple of conversations yesterday when I was picking up my badge, and these conversations centered around all these wonderful technical things that they were able to do in their environments, but the common thread that I found throughout was the lack of visibility as to what was happening on their network. So if they're able to find some way to get to a point where they can have that visibility and they can demonstrate that to the board, that would resonate heavily. So whether it's OT or IT, I'm really indifferent as to who wins that battle. It should be something that is not two different camps going to war with each other.
Well, and I think what I heard there is that if you are, whatever you want to propose, be the solution. Whether
Absolutely.
It's right or wrong, you're going to have to make the business case.
Yeah. It's easy to be a critic. It's hard to get in there and get your face dirty. So if you're able to get in there and get it done, all the power to you.
And do you have to convince the CISO, and then the CISO goes up and convinces the executives, Or do the security people typically get up in front of those executives?
Well, you see, that's the problem. There's no one-size-fits-all for organizations, so you're going to have different types of setups where the CISO will report to the CIO, which is like fox guarding the henhouse sort of thing, or you have them reporting to the risk officer or to the CFO. So it really does depend on the organization, and I mean, I'm not a fan of the just depends answer, but in that particular case, it will vary from one organization to the next.
What's one or two of the biggest mistakes operations technology security people, whether they're assigned to IT or OT, make when they're trying to propose a solution to the CISO or to the executives?
So in my experience, what I ran into was the bypassing of security. So if OT folks were pitching a solution, it was great for what it was good at, right? They're absolutely solid on their core competencies, but in some cases they would try to bypass security, thinking it as a limiter. That flaming sword of justice that only says no to everything. And we want to make sure that we are not that limiter as a security practitioner. We want to make sure that we're enabling the business, whatever that business happens to be. So if they're able to work together with the security folks to get to that common ground, that's a great thing. And security folks can't just be security for the sake of security. It's like, oh, well, we have to lock it down to the point where it's completely unusable. It is really not going to serve anybody's interest long term.
Here in 2022, are there any sort of categories of solutions, whether they be equipment or product categories or even services categories, that you see as being easy sales? Like where you bring this up and the CISOs tend to say yes, 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 or the flip side, are there any that are proving to be really hard to convince a CISO it's worth to spend that money?
So I'm a little bit different on this one. Yes, I work for a vendor, but one of the things I find is the biggest easy sell-in is a two-part. One, define repeatable processes. That helps reduce risk in the organization. The other part of that is looking at a strategy, and I'm going to say the words that half the room will get upset about, zero trust. And this is not about product. This is about reducing risk in the environment. There are some vendors out there that say, oh, if you buy this box with blinky lights, you're going to have zero trust. It's like, no. It is about fundamentally reducing risk in the organization, making sure that you have clear asset inventories, you understand the people that are in your environment, the systems that you're protecting, and making sure the applications that you need in order to keep the lights on are available when you need them.
Do any of those or other ones jump up in terms of what you think people are going to be spending money on in 3 years or 5 years? What if we look out a little bit?
The world today is a little bit messed up, let's put it that way. We have, the war in Ukraine as an example, and the spillover effect from that, I think, is rather significant. And I worry about the longer this draws out, the more this will affect things from, a cybersecurity aspect as well, as in addition to kinetic. I think that we are going to get to a place where we're going to be much better at harmonizing systems and being able to have systems talk to each other in a way that makes sense, so that we can get to platform type technologies where you can just plug in things like a service bus architecture, for want of a better term, so that you don't have to have 10 different vendors and nobody talks to each other. If you're able to have solutions that are going to help you with your outcomes, that's the key piece of the puzzle. If you're having solutions that just don't talk to anybody and it's a nice little shiny box that's going to cost you millions of dollars, you got to really take a step back and say, is this going to make sense for me long term?
When you said that the events in Ukraine, the war that's going on there is having an impact, is it having an impact because people are seeing potential threat increase, or what aspect of that is affecting?
There is definitely a spillover effect of attacks on various systems. You have the hacker armies that we've heard about, which, while good intentions, I totally support that. They have to be cognizant of the fact that the laws of their respective countries still apply. So if you are participating in one of those events where you're attacking targets in Russia, the idealist in me says, jolly on, carry on. But the realist in me realizes that our laws are still in effect. So you may be putting yourself in undue harm as well, in addition to helping. So you have to be able to strike a balance where that makes sense for you. And we look at all these different attacks, and the more that Russia as an example, the more they get backed into a corner, the more likely they are to do things that are going to have unfortunate knock-on effect. And what that manifests as, I don't know at this point, and I want to be wrong, but I see a long road ahead.
We've had some news in the ICS world come out in the last week with this InController and the pipe dream malware that's out there now, and even in Industroyer 2. I always have trouble with that. So we have these new malware families out there. What does, if any, impact that have on the CISO or the executives when they see, these things, new malware that can do all these nasty things to ICS? We don't get a lot of those.
No.
But this was a big one. So does this have an impact on them? And if so, how do you think it impacts them?
Yeah, I definitely see it as having an impact. Like, how do I put it? I like to use the term security debt is one of the things that I like to discuss a fair amount. For me, that means a technical debt that's manifested as a security issue. And I see that this is common in any industry vertical. Any company that's been around longer than 2 weeks has something in their environment that's going to cause them a headache. So being able to get your arms around that is absolutely key. Like one organization I used to work at, I ran an Nmap scan in the SCADA environment, and I hit an open lock-D port on an HMI. It panicked and caused a cascade failure and almost took out the entire system. And this is one of those things where we're looking at these systems that we're relying on in order to keep the lights on, keep water flowing, all the rest of it. But we have to be able to take a shot at them and say, okay, is this going to be resilient under attack? Because unfortunately, we see more and more systems are being remotely enabled, which, if it's done correctly, is fine. But I've seen instances where there was one particular SCADA system in Southeast Asia that was connected to Twitter. This was years ago, but it would literally tweet out status messages throughout the course of the day. The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah. You're talking about technical debt, and I think Brian Owen was the first one in the community I saw talking about it in the ICS world, and he's always hitting me up with ideas about it and thoughts. And the idea is very appealing. I just almost wonder in the ICS world if we have so much debt, technical debt, that it's almost like the U.S. government debt. It's just so large that I guess you can stop it from increasing, but can you actually make a dent in it when you look at all these systems, the level 1 insecure by design issues, the legacy systems, all these poor code bases and lack of security issues? How do we deal with a technical debt that is such a high mountain? What's the best approach to that?
Well, you go back to the analogy of eating the elephant. You got to start somewhere, right? And by just throwing your hands up in the air and walking away from it is not going to remedy anything. Is it tough? Yes. Is it going to take a long time to get your arms around it? Oh, yes. We've all seen, the beige desktop, which I always love to make fun of, that is running mission-critical code written by a summer student that nobody knows how to port it off there. And I've seen that on the raised floor in more organizations than I care to admit. But just because there is a huge amount of it doesn't mean we shouldn't tackle it. Having a risk register to monitor these things and track them to end of job is absolutely essential. And don't have a risk register as a dumping zone for I had one CISO said that they had a risk register and literally everybody put anything on it. And that's malicious compliance at that point. You want to make sure that you're having something that's effective. It also helps when the auditors come calling, and while they come calling. One organization I worked at, we had 6 audits running simultaneously, which to this day I still don't know why they did that. But as a result of having a risk register, we were able to handle that with the auditors and able to show them that, yes, these have been identified. There is the plan in place to track at the end of job. Will it take years in some cases? Yes, of course. But the auditors were happy in that it was identified and being worked on.
I wonder, though, if you're talking about this elephant that is technical debt, and yes, probably all that debt is not going to have the same impact on you from a risk perspective. So in the ICS world, which again you have some familiarity with,
yep.
Where would you start eating? What debt would you be looking to retire soonest?
I honestly, I would look at whatever the most high risk is for your particular organization. What is going to have the material impact if it goes down? If you walk over there, pull the plug out of system X, Y, or Z, Is it going to knock out, the grid? Is it going to, rank those as the highest ones that are being addressed. Yes, there's low-hanging fruit that you can knock off, but you really want to concentrate on the really high-risk items, and that will obviously vary from one place to the next.
So if I had, let's say, a bunch of Windows XP computers out there, they still might not be the right thing to deal with, right? Even though they probably have the more vulnerabilities, bigger issues than a lot of other things. If they're not critical computers, then should I retire that debt early on, or just say, yeah, I've got some XP out there?
Well, if you have the capacity to do so, yes, right? And it's really about, the bench strength of the organization. What can you do in a certain amount of time? Do you have compensating controls in place? Do you have network zone segmentation? Are you able to make sure that these systems are not facing the internet? Unfortunately, far too often they are, but you want to make sure that those things are not still around there. I mean, I know of one power company that still has their HVAC systems being run by OS2 Warp. And the last I heard, that system had not been rebooted in 10 years. Oh, 12 years, sorry.
Very reliable.
Very reliable. But if that was even remotely hanging off the internet, well, most people wouldn't know what to do with it. But there's still the possibility. I still remember. But yeah, it's a problem. So yeah, sorry, going back to your question about addressing these. Yes, if you have compensating controls where you can have a zone, segment those off until you can address them, that's one thing. You want to make sure that you have trusted partners that you can deal with within the industry, because nobody has enough staff, nobody has enough budget. But if you're able to bring in folks to augment your systems, augment your teams, if you're able to bring in automation into your environment, that'll help alleviate that so you can concentrate on what's most important for your organization, that'll help as well.
I guess the tough part is, and we'll get off the CISO, one other thing I want to talk to you about, but a lot of times if you do an assessment, and I know many people here do assessments, if you were to, for example, document every vulnerability and print out the pages, it'd be a thick report, right? You'd show all these misconfigurations, all these missing patches. If something hasn't been patched for 3 years, you can say you haven't been patched for 3 years, or you could print them all out and or list them all in your report. How does a CISO deal with a big report like that? Can they just say, yeah, we're going to cut out 10 pages of the report and work on that? Or when you hand that to a CISO, what are they supposed to do with it?
Well, that is one of the limiting factors that security people have put on themselves when they're dealing with senior management, is providing those reports. I had an external pen test team do that to me years ago, where they literally printed it off, and it was about that thick, and they pushed it across the table at me. I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? Because there was no ranking as to the severity of issues. It was just basically printing out NSS scans and all the rest of it. It was just absolutely nonsensical gibberish at that point. So if you're not able to clearly articulate what the issues are that are affecting the environment, then it's going to be lost. And if you're running around with your hair on fire saying, oh, there's a 0 day for this, that, and the other thing, if you're not speaking in terms that they understand, if you're not identifying it as a risk and adding what the impact is financially or otherwise to the organization, then they're not going to hear you. So making sure that you are communicating in a way that is clear and concise, and when you're doing your presentations, don't make it that great big tome. This isn't Lord of the Rings. You don't want to push that huge book across at them.
Well, and I think, and I used to do those assessments, I don't do them anymore. I think it's really important for the asset owners to understand when they're contracting for one of these, what they're going to get back.
Yes.
Because if it's the worst case is you get one of these things back, and of course you paid for it, so it gets sent up the chain, and then you have to live with the results. So you really have to understand what you're going to present to your senior management, I think.
Yeah, and the other side of that too is when you have one of these engagements, you don't want to say, oh, you can test this system between 5 and 5:15 on every second Tuesday.
Yeah.
You're not going to get a clear understanding as to what's your environment. You need to understand those risks. And I remember I did a pen test where I said anything was fair game.
Yeah.
And that started at 9 a.m. My phone was ringing at 9:14. They had already breached the network. They had already taken over the Active Directory, and they were in the process of cracking all the passwords. And they never would have been able to do any of that had I limited the scope.
Yeah.
And it was all because somebody had attached a Polycom device to the internet so that they could work on it at home. They had a web interface. They were able to go in there, configure it, add SSH, done.
Okay, let's take a little shift here.
Sure.
and this is a little bit Cisco related, but I know you're not in this group of Cisco, but Cisco acquired Centrio
Yes.
a while ago, asset inventory detection vendor, and has sort of turned that offering into cyber vision. You have so many product names, I have to look to make sure I got it right.
I have to look too.
What I found most interesting in the way that Cisco did this is that they're making this now available in the switches as a container. So not all switches, but a certain family and line of switches, the more modern switches basically, they can run a container. And then they're charging by IP address, not by how many containers you put out there. So you could, in theory, deploy, if you have a new Cisco switched architecture, you could deploy it on every switch if you wanted, or a few. It's a long intro to a question, but the question I have is, once we see this, whether it's Cisco or something else, once we see this OT security capability integrated into the network infrastructure, do you see the OT security companies going away? Or do you see that there's always going to be this idea that this network infrastructure is IT, and then we have to put a separate OT product layer on top of that?
I think for the foreseeable future, you will see multiple vendors out there. I mean, it would be disingenuous of me to say, this is magical dust, we just sprinkle it on the network and you're good to go. It definitely is going to take a while before we shift to that convergence of having everything harmonized. I honestly see them surviving for quite a few years to come. Yes, and because it really does boil down to what is the requirement of the customer. The customer is the one that has to dictate what they need in their environment. They don't want to just go with a vendor because they took them to play golf. There was, when I used to be at Hydro One back in the day, I had so many vendors offering to take me to golf that I actually sat down and figured it out. If I had taken them up on it, I would have been playing golf for 4 months straight and never have stepped foot in the office. It was nuts. But, a bit of a tangent, sorry, I lost myself there. But, the reality is, yes, there will be multiple vendors. It's not a case of they're going to go away overnight. They may change into something else over time. I don't know. I can't quite see that far down.
Well, and if we take it away from Cisco, I mean, you could look at like a QRadar or a Splunk or something like that. And we have a large number of detection vendors in the OT space that feed those. But in theory, that same capability could be integrated into those solutions. But are you still, do you see that, do you see eventually those coming together and being one, or do you think that they're going to still be enough specialized nature of the OT one that it will remain separate?
No, I see them coming together. Like going back to the C word of convergence, I believe that we will get there at some point down the road. It's going to take some time, absolutely. But I do believe wholeheartedly that we can get to that point. Yes, there are mission critical assets, bad things happen when those systems go down, but we have the capacity to train folks, we have the capacity to build that software in such a way that it can work together with other systems so that you have that visibility, and that's the key piece of the puzzle. It's like I've had so many conversations where it's like all these great technical solutions, but visibility was lacking. So having that visibility, having all those systems come together in such a way that provides folks with that, and even layering in something like DNN and being able to have that present to you in the morning when you log in, saying there are 27 problems, these are 2 you should really look at, would really shorten the mean time to response.
Are you hearing that visibility requirement from a lot of your CISOs and customers, or are you encouraging them in that direction?
Both. I am absolutely, I've been hearing that now for 2 years, where it's amazing. It doesn't matter what industry vertical it is, they are all saying the same thing. The visibility is the problem that they're having. I remember one vendor that would remain nameless, actually they're gone now, promised me a single pane of glass back in 2003. They never delivered it. And now they're gone. But these are the kind of things where we have to make sure that as vendors that we are able to deliver products that are going to satisfy the outcomes of the users. And because if we're just buying them and saying you have to buy this because we said so is absolutely nonsensical, right? We have to be able to build that relationship, because the way it used to be of somebody sold you a box, dropped on a landing dock, and you never saw them again. I experienced that too many times. Is gone. We're building relationships, we're moving more to SaaS-based offerings and things like that. So we have to look at it as relationship building. So you have to build that long-term interaction with the customers.
Maybe as a closing thought, I'm just curious, what are you passionate about in the, in the technology area, whether it be a product, a service, a problem? What is it that really gets you kind of jazzed and you're enjoying studying and learning and figuring it out?
Okay, well, so the one that I'm loud about is security debt, because it is everywhere. And I've experienced it myself. I've seen systems that were older than me in some cases, and that's saying something. What I really get jazzed about, to go off on a complete tangent that I've been doing a lot of research on, is DNA data storage, which is completely unrelated to this, but being able to, like, in your own DNA, you can write up to about 4 petabytes worth of data. So I've been doing I've been doing that as a research project for my grad studies.
Oh, okay. Well, very interesting. Well, Dave, I really appreciate you coming down and shifting your schedule here to move up to the morning. And are you going to be around at the Cabana sessions for people to talk to?
I will be around until Thursday, and thank you very much for having me. This is a bucket list item for me, so I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here and chat with you.
Okay. Thank you very much.